So good afternoon to everyone in South America, or some other place that is still afternoon. Good afternoon for our professor and speaker, Professor Florian, our participants, and everyone who's watching us now or after on YouTube. Professor Florian, it's a great pleasure to learn with you today on the issue of corporate social responsibility and human rights advocacy in the post-COVID era. My name is Victoria. Such a great time to be here today with Daniela, João, my colleagues and co-organizers of the working group, as well as our friends and debaters, Natalia Lacerda and Gustavo Marin. And probably as soon as possible with our resilient audience who stayed with us through this year, more than 20 webinars on different topics. So I need to share with you all that it's our penultimate webinar of the year, which makes me very sad because it went by quickly and happy at the same time because it means Christmas is approaching, which is not bad either, right? So, Professor, I must say that under the supervision of our mentor and Professor Eduardo Sardiniz, when we idealized the working group earlier this year to bring the human rights and companies agenda, we did not imagine that we would have the participation and prestige of so many colleagues, academics and professionals from Brazil, but also from abroad, enriching the dialogues with their experience. It's very gratifying for us of the webinars that we do to be able to count on experts talking about the proposed topics and encouraging us, as we say here in Brazil, to think more outside the box. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I'm just gonna quickly present our speaker. Professor Florian Wettstein is Professor of Business Ethics at the Institute for Business Ethics and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of St. Gallen, as well as Director of the Institute of Business Ethics. Professor, after your presentation, we will open a quick panel for questions, and our participants feel free to elaborate and bring your own remarks. Wish you all a great webinar.
All right, thank you very much. As you say, I think the possibility to talk to each other across continents and nations has greatly expanded, right? Paradoxically, during a time when there's great restrictions in terms of meeting in person and so on, but I think there's also certain takeaways that have improved the possibilities, also to have scholarly discourse right across boundaries and so on. And so I'm very happy to be here today, here still at my office. And of course I would have much more liked to be with you there in person, but I think this is a great opportunity also to have this conversation. So I'm gonna share my screen, and I hope that's going to work. Yes, you can see this now, right?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
All right, so I'm just gonna jump in, and maybe with a quick remark about the title of my presentation. I'm just gonna go back so that you can read it again: Corporate Social Responsibility and Human Rights Advocacy in the Post-COVID Era. And that's a title that is not that I didn't come up with, but that I think Victoria sent me back then when you asked whether I would do this webinar, and I really liked the title, and so I thought I'm just going to stick with it, even though you of course mentioned the opportunity to also change the title. And I liked it particularly because it connects, you know, some of my previous work, human rights advocacy, corporate responsibility, with the quite specific and special times that we're in today. And so it gave me an opportunity to really reflect on my past work and how it applies specifically to this very special time that we're in, and really enjoyed also doing that. And this being said, this presentation is really kind of a mix and match of different perspectives and things that I've researched in the past and written on in the past. kind of throw them together and apply them in some sense to what you call here the post-COVID era. And the main aim of the presentation, I guess, is really what I've also tried to do in the past, which is to argue for a really more demanding understanding of corporate responsibility. And I think it applies even more now than previously, that we need to ask more of corporations in terms of how they address and also further and promote human rights. So I think the first question then that comes up is what that post-COVID era actually is. And unfortunately, I think currently we're still not in the post-COVID area, we're still quite in the midst of it. But maybe looking back at one point, at this time more generally, I think this is a time where we have faced, I guess, major crises, and maybe that's not all that special, right? Because I think crises have always kind of accompanied human history. Nevertheless, I think we are faced with quite fundamental crises that we have to solve in order to also, save humanity and planet, such as, for example, the climate and biodiversity crisis that is really becoming acute. And that we do have to come up with solutions fairly fast, and not only come up with solutions, but actually act on solutions, which, as we have seen in the past weeks, is still a big obstacle today, lack of political will and so on. So, and also there, I think corporations are called on to step up their game. Also, the financial crisis of 2008, it's by far not the only financial crisis that we have faced, but it was a crisis of truly global dimensions, which makes it special, and a crisis that we can still, in some sense, feel today, right? It's more than 10 years after that, we still deal with the ramifications of that crisis. So I think the dimensions of those crises also are increasing. A crisis of that, the rise of right-wing populism across the world, also in well-established democratic nations, and fake news that kind of accompanies it, so that the general skepticism towards scholarship and science that fuels these populist movements, and that's a crisis that also underpins and accelerates, in some sense, kind of accompanying crises, right? Such as, for example, the climate change, right? Which makes it more difficult to really come up with solutions and actually gain support and momentum for solutions that we certainly would have. And of course, health crises, and such as the COVID pandemic, but also other ones that we've seen in the past, and it seems to kind of accelerate. We experience more and more of those crises. The more interdependent and connected we get as a world, the more global those crises get, and the faster they really kind of move around the globe. And I think those crises do have, not surprisingly, of course, direct and indirect impacts also on businesses. And here's just a few examples. So the financial crisis, of course, led to massive financial losses for businesses. It led to businesses actually going down, bankruptcies. But then on the other hand, there was also the massive bailouts of banks, which has also changed perhaps business practices at banks. It also led to further regulation and has changed the context in which those banks do business. And the same goes for the climate crisis. Also there we see more and more tighter regulation that change the way that companies interact also in terms of climate. On the positive side, we see new markets develop, green markets in a sense, where companies can also exploit opportunities that arrive through those crises. So there's always kind of two sides, right? There's the opportunity side, and of course also the side of massive losses that we incur through them. Populism crisis, if you want to call this a crisis, leads to alienation, for example, of minority groups within also companies. So that's something that corporations more and more have to deal with, harassments and so on. If you're a tech company, you see yourself confronted with the demand and claim that you have to moderate content, which is something that previously we haven't really asked those companies to do, but that's more and more, and it's further and further growing. I think the way they have to really engage in content moderation also applies to news platforms, for example. You know, the commenting on news articles and so on is more and more also restricted, moderated. And then, of course, a pandemic, and that's kind of alluding to the post-COVID era. We've seen supply chain disruptions. The lockdowns have affected business massively in fundamental ways. Have also driven certain businesses out of business. Has led to different ways of doing business, remote work settings, and so on. So we see that those crises really impact businesses in very fundamental ways. But it also has, and that's more what I want to talk about. It also has implications for how we see corporate responsibility, especially in connection in regard to those crises. And there's two sides of the coin here as well. On the one hand, businesses are often seen as major contributors to the or even causes of those crises. Right, banks in the financial crisis have a massive, decisive role in bringing this crisis about and also expanding the crisis around the globe. Extractive companies, oil companies, or the automotive industry is seen to have a major stake in the climate crisis. And we look to those companies also to change their ways in order to moderate the impacts of those crises. Social media companies have a large stake in the rise of populism, and also in terms of trying to ease and mitigate the impacts of those movements. But at the same time, we also look at those businesses for solutions. Right? So more and more, I think we really kind of, when we talk about solutions, we don't just talk about governments and states who have to address those crises, but we actually directly look also at companies and what they not only can do, but what they ought to do to ease those crises. And what is interesting, I think, is that we're not just looking at, even though as well, but not only looking at market-based solutions. So we don't just ask them to kind of, address those crises with, smart business solutions, but we ask them to actually really take responsibility, right? Address those crises from a responsibility-based standpoint with their corporate, social, or just corporate responsibility. And that is where I kind of want to start to connect this to my previous work. And of course, if you say, well, we ask businesses to address those crises in terms of responsibility, then the question is, well, what responsibility are we talking about here? And there's two major approaches that I want to briefly touch on that have also coined, I think, debates on corporate responsibility more generally in the past, and which are really competing, to quite some degree, competing models of corporate responsibility, also in terms of how they are equipped to address those crises, in my view. There's CSR, corporate social responsibility, on the one hand, which has really kind of dominated the discussion on corporate responsibility more generally in the past decades. And then there is this newer debate, which you are, of course, well familiar with, as the Business and Human Rights Working Group at your university, which is Business and Human Rights, and which is, in that sense, a much younger discussion. And also is a discussion with different connotations. And in my view, it's also a discussion that is much better equipped, maybe not surprisingly, I would say something like this. But I think business and human rights as a discussion is better equipped to address the fundamental and defining crises of our time. For example, the pandemic that we're facing now. And there's a reason for why I perceive CSR as not well equipped to deal with those crises. It's not that it's a useless concept or a useless discussion and that it cannot have any impact on those issues. But I just think business and human rights is better positioned to really have a kind of a more fundamental impact on solving those issues that we face. The main reason I see CSR kind of being a mismatch to the nature of the crisis that we face is that CSR has been perceived predominantly kind of from a private perspective or as a private responsibility, really. So CSR is really based on this idea and assumption of a very sharp distinction between what is public and what is private, right? And I think the crisis that we see today, and also the pandemic, perhaps particularly, show a different picture of the world. It's a world where private and public spaces blur, and are very, very much interdependent also. And the sharp division between private and public, I think, doesn't really apply neatly anymore to the kind of world in which we live. Nevertheless, I think at least conventional views on CSR are still very much based on this worldview of these sharp divisions. And when I say conventional views on CSR, I mean, for example, not political CSR, which is exactly kind of a shift away within the CSR discussion, a shift away from those conventional assumptions that CSR has commonly been based on. So I'm talking about more the conventional, the dominant, the mainstream views on corporate social responsibility. So they're conceptualized as private responsibility, meaning that we see corporate social responsibility as a responsibility that corporations have to or ought to adopt within their private space, right? That the private space that is defined by ultimately the state, who carves out for private actors that space in which they can act without major interference of the public actors. And so if we look at the world that way, then the state is responsible for everything that is public, and the private actors can do basically what they would like to do within that private space that the state leaves us to do so. But that doesn't mean that we can do whatever we want within that private space. There's still the assumption or the expectations that we use our freedom within that private space in a responsible manner. And that is what corporate social responsibility addresses, right? So it asks, well, how can corporations act responsibly within their private space? But what it does not do is basically demand that corporations take certain responsibility also for the public space, kind of reaching over to what the state is responsible for. And so conceptualized as private responsibility, corporate social responsibility is seen as voluntary, so it's not imposed on corporations, and it's more kind of a virtue-based responsibility that they take based on goodwill and voluntary commitment to acting in responsible ways. It is apolitical because, as I said, it's not meant to have a public character. It's not a responsibility for public issues and public matters unless the state has privatized those public issues. But then they turn private, right? And as such are again addressed in a more voluntary private responsibility way. And because of that, corporate social responsibility tends to be conceptualized in a very corporate-centric way, which means that corporations define for what they want to be, in a sense, responsible, what they prioritize in terms of what is being addressed and what is being not addressed, or what is being addressed first and what is being addressed second, and in what way things are being addressed. And because of that, usually what we see is that corporate social responsibility is fairly instrumental in terms of its outlook. That's the typical kind of business case for corporate social responsibility. So if corporations decide what to address, then those issues have priority that will also generate in some sort the benefit or an opportunity for businesses, right? And there you see always or often the claim that for this business case that corporate social responsibility should also pay for corporations. And if it does so, then it will be addressed, and as such corporations can make a difference. But there's of course problems attached to these views on corporate responsibility, severe normative problems also. And that's why I feel addressing the really fundamental issues and crises that we face today through this lens is missing the core of the actual problem, because it can only address them so far as they can be turned into priorities for businesses, as they kind of attached to the interests of businesses, as far as they can be turned into business opportunities. Also at the real problems, the core of the problems that nobody actually wants to address will also remain unaddressed if you look at them through this lens. So solutions, and I think experience shows then also, if you look at the impact of corporate social responsibility and the impact it has had on the ground, we often come to the conclusion that it's been fairly piecemeal and incomplete, incoherent also in terms of the approaches. And as such, there's not a coherent strategy and solution to address the problem as a holistic, in a holistic sense. And I think that here the human rights perspective can really bring something to the table that the corporate social responsibility cannot. So generally, I think business and human rights, from that perspective, is better equipped to deal with those crises. And just in a nutshell, the reasons for that is because those crises are of truly global extent, and as such we need, in a sense, also a global reference point to define what the responsibilities of businesses should be in terms of addressing them. If we don't want to, just be completely relativistic and just say, to each their own, that they should just address what they like to prioritize. And I think human rights can provide this framework that we can develop a coherent approach that applies to global businesses in terms of really kind of addressing those global problems. There are also public crises that they don't unfold in the private space, and as such they're a public matter that need to be addressed also as a public issue, meaning also that there needs to be public accountability of those who address those problems. And finally, and of course, maybe most importantly, those crises touch on fundamental interests and fundamental rights of people. So the implications of this crisis really are fundamental in the sense that they affect the very human rights of people in manifold ways. And I think as such, they should be addressed as such, and the responsibility should be framed in terms of those fundamental interests and rights. And as I said before, the human rights perspective, of course, is on the one hand interesting and fruitful because we do have this really broadly accepted, and I'm using here the term universal, and of course that can be debated as to what degree and in what sense human rights are universal. But they can serve as some sort of a universal reference point from which we can derive responsibilities. And as such, with the UNGPs, for example, we also have developed very concrete in some sense instruments, for example, human rights due diligence. And I'm not a huge fan of the human rights due diligence concept, but it certainly provides a practical approach to deal with those responsibilities, and as such, it can really kind of at least be a step on the journey to develop fuller understanding of what corporate responsibility needs to look like. It's an approach that corporations can work with that global reference point, and I think that's certainly a step forward to compare to the kind of more conventional ideas of CSR that we have been relying on in the past. But I think that the main point here in terms of the comparison to CSR is really that business and human rights perceives corporate responsibility not as a private matter, but as a public and political matter, at least implicitly, right? So corporate responsibility framed within the business and human rights discourse is really understood as a public responsibility. And to just illustrate what the difference is of those two perspectives, if you look at human rights responsibility, or if you frame human rights responsibility through a CSR lens, what it means is that you basically pull human rights into the private domain, right? So in some sense, you privatize human rights because you subject it to private responsibility, and you subject it to the kind of different prioritizations of businesses and so on. So you need to kind of privatize them in order to make them accessible to corporate social responsibility. Business and human rights works exactly the other way around, at least from my perspective. It's not about pulling human rights into the private domain, but it is about pushing corporate responsibility into the public domain, extending corporate responsibility to addressing public issues. And as such, taking public responsibility and perhaps even more importantly, accept public accountability for those responsibilities. And business and human rights has always been about the accountability piece, which has always been missing in the CSR perspective, right? Because accountability in the private domain is not as crucial and necessary as it is when you look at corporations really as public actors taking on public responsibilities for such fundamental issues as human rights. So it's about the politicization of corporate responsibility rather than the privatization of human rights. And I think that makes a massive difference, not just conceptually, but also in terms of in terms of practice and what the practical implications are of through which lens we address human rights problems. But that does not mean, of course, that the business and human rights discourse today is, kind of the silver bullet to solving the problems that we face. And there are, of course, certain limitations to the, I call it here, the current B&HR paradigm as well. And by business and human rights paradigm, I mean basically the way business and human rights is framed through the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles. Business and human rights, because this is I mean it was meant to create the focal point for the business and human rights debate, and it succeeded in doing so. And there's good things about that, but there's also, of course, a flip side of the coin, which means that the discourse has in some sense become fairly narrow, centering on those UN guiding principles, and I think addressing the crisis today through a business and human rights lens would also require that we open up that business and human rights discourse again beyond the fairly narrow confines of how the UNGPs define corporate responsibility, for example. And there's a very particular way, of course, how human rights responsibility of businesses are framed within the UNGPs. So it's framed as a negative responsibility, as do no harm in that sense. So businesses have a responsibility to respect, and I don't think I need to go, expand on this much more, because I think people are fairly familiar with what the UNGPs look like. But it's still interesting to just kind of, at least mention the core of it, right? So the responsibility to respect human rights is framed as a responsibility not to do harm, not to infringe on the rights of others. And corporate responsibilities are really limited fairly narrowly to this category. In some fairly narrowly defined contexts, they may have responsibilities beyond that, but as general responsibility, this is what the corporate responsibility to respect is. And so Ruggie, when he drew up the UNGPs, he made it very clear that those are the unique responsibilities of corporations or business actors, and that those responsibilities should not be entangled with state obligations, right? So he's very cautious in kind of framing corporate responsibility in a wide sense, so that there would not be any confusion between what the state is responsible for and what businesses are responsible for. And as such, he also defined those responsibility between those two actors as differentiated but complementary. So he really draws a very clear-cut line between state obligations and business responsibilities. And this, of course, creates conceptual clarity, and it becomes perhaps easy to talk about business responsibilities in terms of human rights, and to kind of allocate responsibilities conceptually between those actors. But I'm just not sure, and I've never been sure whether this is an appropriate way to address the complexities of the world in which we live today. I think the situations in which those divisions of responsibilities between states and corporations are much more frequent than situations in which they are actually able to draw this division in such clear-cut ways as the UNGP's envisions. And so if you look at the crisis that we face, I'm a little skeptical to accept the claim, ultimately, that the implicit claim, at least in the UNGPs, that all that we have to ask businesses to do is simply not making things worse. And then this is what the do no harm claim actually is. So what we can demand of businesses really that they don't make the crisis worse, but we cannot really ask them to, make things better and address those crises in proactive ways. And so my take has always been that what we really need is not models of divided responsibility, but actually complex model of shared and collaborative responsibilities that are based on not just negative do no harm responsibilities, but also on positive contributions of business. And I've mentioned that before. I think that would have been and still is a real challenge in business rights, is to, especially for our scholars and conceptual thinkers in a sense, and perhaps particularly perhaps for those of us addressing these issues from a more philosophical point of view. I think the real challenge is really to come up with those models of shared responsibility, but without, and I think Ruggie was right there, but without confusing states and corporations. But that's the real complexity about it. I think it's the easy way out to say, well, because we can't confuse the responsibilities of states and corporations, we just kind of divide the responsibility so much that there's absolutely no overlap, because I think this is just not a fair representation of what the world looks like today. So the real challenge is really to capture the complexity of the world and then develop models in which we can differentiate between those two actors, but in which the responsibilities, the relation between those responsibilities between those two actors are much more interdependent, collaborative, and shared. And I think we're not there yet, but that, I think, is what it takes to really address the post-COVID challenge and the crisis that we face today, at least if we want to address it from a human rights perspective. So if we want to basically expand corporate responsibility beyond just do no harm, or kind of, venture into the realm of positive corporate human rights responsibility, then I see two main approaches, and I guess there are probably more approaches than that, but those are the two approaches that I have been perhaps exploring in more depth in my previous work. The first one is kind of unfolding within the UNGP's paradigm, and it just, you may just ask the question, well, what does it actually mean to respect human rights? Does respecting human rights really only mean to just not do harm? Or are there contexts in which the very idea of respecting human rights actually implies more than just not violating human rights? And respect is, as always, at least from a philosophical point of view, respect implies certainly a positive acknowledgement of human beings, right? And not just leaving them alone and not infringing on their rights, but there's a positive element to respect that is connected to a proactive acknowledgement of their moral worth also as human beings. And there's certainly contexts in which this could lead to positive responsibility. If you only think about a pharma company within a health crisis, for example, is all that we can ask of such a pharmaceutical company not to make things worse, or does respecting human beings who suffer from health detriments not imply much more for a company that would actually have the means to address and those issues and make things better? For me, this is a matter of respect, and it's really about how we define what respect of human rights is. And that would still be, in some sense, within the paradigm of the UNGPs. It would still be just asking corporations to respect human rights, but it's just a much more holistic and fuller notion of respect that we presuppose when we talk about it. And the second approach is to expand beyond respect into the other duty categories that currently are assigned, at least from the perspective of the UNGPs, assigned only to the state, right? And that's the duty to protect, the duty to fulfill human rights. And I've in my work tried to come up and build foundations for arguments for why it makes sense to expand responsibilities also of corporations into those two categories of duty. So why corporations do have a responsibility in some contexts also to respect or protect human rights, and why they have responsibilities also to fulfill human rights in addition to also respect human rights. One of those contexts is the context of silent complicity, for example. I've tried to show that silent complicity as a context in and of itself presupposes that we assume that corporations have a duty to protect. And if they don't have that duty to protect, it doesn't make sense to speak of the side of them being silently complicit. But even the UNGPs, the Global Compact, and all those different policy instruments, they actually assume that silent complicity is a concept that applies to corporations. And so it's inconsistent, in my view, to argue that silent complicity applies to corporations, but then deny that they have a responsibility, a positive responsibility to protect. So that's a more backward-looking context in which I think corporations can have responsibility also in the category of protecting human rights. And then there's also more forward-looking context, and those are particularly contexts of structural injustice, where I think we can frame arguments that move into the direction of also assigning positive responsibility to corporations. And I think that is the context that really applies to the post-COVID era and the crisis that we face, because many of those crises, at least in terms of their impacts and implications, are of structural nature. Right? So it is the structure of our society that decides over who, carries the burdens, the major burdens of those crises, and who potentially also benefits from those crises. And so addressing the crisis and the impacts, I think, is a structural issue. And so it's then about assigning structural responsibility for those crises. And there we can, for example, look at Iris Marion Young's social connection model, which is by now a concept that has been theorized quite a bit, especially in business ethics, but slowly and surely also starting to gain traction beyond just business ethics and perhaps political philosophy. And Iris Marion Young, she addressed exactly those contexts, and she said, if we face structural injustices, our conventional liability-based models of responsibility are simply not sufficient to solve those crises. By conventional liability-based models of responsibility meant kind of backward-looking responsibility models that we try to kind of isolate those who are responsible for bringing the crisis about and then say, well, because you caused the crisis, you now have to fix it. But in those structural contexts, this is very difficult, sometimes impossible to really kind of isolate those who are, in a sense, guilty for bringing the crisis about. And Iris Marion Young then argues, well, if we face those kind of issues and we want to solve them, then we have to look at those who can make a difference, a positive difference in the future, no matter whether they brought the crisis about and are responsible for it or not. We just need to address in a proactive way the crisis by holding those accountable and responsible that are best positioned to do so. And so she came up with different parameters of, what defines the strength of an actor's responsibility, and that's based in her model, based on power of an actor, on who benefits from structural injustice, and those who benefit are those who are also responsible to change it, in a sense. Those who have the strongest interest in change, they have a stronger responsibility. So she also holds victims in some sense, right? Victims of for example, human rights, structural human rights violations, responsible to do their share of trying to push for change. And then, very importantly, collective ability. So those are responsible for changing structures that are positioned to act collectively towards change. And it is, I think, a defining issue of structural problems, that they can only be solved by actors of different sectors and venues to collaborate and come together and work for such shared and collaborative solutions. And she calls this political responsibility. For Iris Marion Young, this is what is the definition of a political responsibility, in the sense of, again, shared, collaborative, also in a way communicative responsibility. And so that's, if you look at it from that perspective, then certainly corporations are among those actors which are well placed for many of the structural problems that we face today, in bringing about, or at least working towards solutions, and not just to be a part of those solutions, but also to really kind of take the lead in terms of creating and also gathering actors and bringing them together and working towards collective solutions. And here, and now I'm going to come to the end of the presentation. This is what connects to human rights advocacy. So that's the last piece in the title of the presentation. Because human rights advocacy, in some sense, and I've written about human rights advocacy in the past, is maybe a quintessential political responsibility. If if you agree that is actually a responsibility of businesses, then that would be the epitome of a political responsibility, I guess, of corporations. So I think corporate human rights advocacy would be a part of those political responsibilities for structural injustices that Iris Marion Young envisioned, in a sense. And by human rights advocacy, I mean a whole host of different activities, from speaking up, organizing, protesting, even intervening for human rights, as a part of a larger responsibility to protect of corporations. And also here, there's different contexts, I think, in which you may conceptualize such a responsibility to engage in human rights advocacy of corporations, but also in which you have in practice already seen corporations actually engaging in human rights advocacy. And I think it's becoming more and more frequent for whatever reason. Of course, we can also be critical and question the reasons why corporations engage in those kind of activities. But bottom line is, we do see it happen in practice, that corporations are more and more inclined to advocate for certain pro-social reasons. Silent complicity, again, is the one context in which I've worked quite a bit on what human rights advocacy means, what it means to intervene, what it means to protect in those contexts. But also pro-social activism, right? Corporations speaking up for marriage equality, which we've seen in the US, but also beyond, for example, or speaking up against racism. I would also frame that as a kind of political advocacy of corporations. And there's also regulatory activism that we see more and more corporations speaking up for mandatory human rights due diligence laws in many countries, in which we see those initiatives kind of popping up, or for stronger climate legislation, for example. So those are all kind of instances of where we see advocacy of corporations, and I think they can be framed in some sense as a responsibility also to protect human rights. And of course, as I said before, there's of course the open question whether corporations should, or whether we want corporations to engage in those kind of activities, whether we want them to actually speak up for such social causes and so on, well knowing that they have huge power in influencing and shaping public discourses, or even in instances where they may even confront governments and opposing perhaps certain legislations and policies, as we've seen, for example, in the populism crisis that I mentioned before, corporations actually standing up against policies that Trump put in place during his presidency, and really making use of their leverage also over governments. It's an open question whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but we do see it happen, and I think it's a really interesting, exciting area to do research in. What I've tried to do, and that's the last thing I'm gonna say here, is to also come up with certain safeguards of. I do feel there is context and spaces in which such corporate human rights advocacy is legitimate, and that we should call on corporations to engage in those activities. But those contexts also need to be defined fairly well, I think, and so I've tried to do that in the past. What I have as a disclaimer, perhaps, what I'm assuming is, of course, that when I frame this and conceptualize this, the assumption is that corporations do so based on a public spirited concern for human rights, right? So this is the way. So it's the assumption, if they do so based on this assumption, then what do the safeguards need to be that are in place? Whether this is what practice looks like, that's of course a whole different question. Of course, there's tons of corporations that have been jumping on the bandwagon of arguing for marriage equality and things like this without any concern really in a substantive matter. They're just a more kind of out of opportunistic considerations, because they felt like, oh, now we have to speak up for marriage equality because all our competitors are doing so. So let's do it as well. So that's the assumption. And just some of those safeguards, I've listed some there. Responsiveness, for example. So corporations should be, when they do so, they should be doing so as a response to what they see happening within society, so that there needs to be a public view that action rather than inaction is needed from corporation, right? So there needs to be an expectation also that corporations engage in those activities or stand up for the rights of certain minority groups and so on. They need to do so in a collaborative fashion. So we don't want them to basically act on their own, based on their own kind of reading of what is happening, but they should collaborate with, for example, human rights institutions who have the right expertise that corporations are often lacking in those matters. But also collaborate, for example, with other companies that are kind of pulling in the same direction. They should be transparent. That's the accountability piece. About their advocacy and what they advocate for, so that they can be held accountable within the public space in which they operate. And most importantly, I think, is authenticity, so that we want corporations to engage in those activities that have engaged or have a track record, basically, on furthering and promoting those issues. And I think this is what really divides the true advocates from the opportunistic ones within those movements that we've seen in the past. For example, for marriage equality or against racism, there are certain companies that have a track record, because that we can see that they, you can follow back years, and they have engaged in campaigns against racism and have promoted those issues within and outside of the company, and those, for me, have earned the right to advocate also publicly, because they're authentic in their concern for those issues. And then there's others who are not. And then the last one is severity, so that the issues that they address really are kind of the defining issues, human rights issues that we face that are of large scale, systematic and ongoing human rights violations that where condemnation is widespread and which really need to be addressed in a very urgent way. I think those are the contexts in which it makes sense that the corporations that are authentic address them in a very public and forceful way. And I think that is it. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to really reflect on my own work a little bit and trying to apply them to the current times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florian, for the enlightening presentation. Actually, you mentioned the silent complicity in the context. Our last webinar with Professor Susana Aires from Portugal actually addressed this topic, and we could see that the silent complicity, the corporate complicity, has been seen as a problem which has even given rise to the use of criminal law. And it's very interesting to know that you had actually brought this topic too. And thank you for sharing your perspective and the very interesting approach. I share many of our concerns and your prognostic for the future. About the topic, I have some concerns regarding specifically the corporate social responsibility as a mandatory obligation, and if there is an ideal of regulatory approach. But before presenting my own question, I would like to invite our debaters. So please, Natalia and Gustavo, who would like to present first your remark?
Where is Gustavo?
It's okay for me if Natalia wants to start. If it's okay for me, I go after.
Okay, I have some questions to make. I have read your paper about political corporate advocacy, and it was very a high clarification for me, because I've never seen companies as a political actors, not in this way that you have put. And all the time I was wondering about the role of the regulator in this scenario. Is there any role, any space for regulators to in order to implement, or in order to put some responsibility, especially for those who are very strong, or that have that benefit from the social injustice, as you put before. And I would like to know about the questions of legitimacy, especially regarding to the stakeholders in this kind of political advocacy matters.
Should I address this right now, or are we collecting first and then address it later?
Do you prefer to answer one by one, Professor, or if we make like a whole panel and you answer?
Sure, we can. But whatever works for you, we can go one by one. That's fine. Maybe so, just to keep it fresh in our minds. Maybe I can briefly address it. I mean, that the role of the regulator within the whole kind of political advocacy claim is interesting, because very often I think the advocacy is called for exactly in those contexts in which the regulator is not being active to the degree that they kind of are seen that they should, at least, right? So that in many instances, that's what I called before regulatory activism. I mean, that's just a term I came up with, and there's probably better terms for that. But very often I think that activism really aims at pushing the regulator to actually implement tougher regulations on certain issues. or more, perhaps more liberal one in terms of marriage equality, right? Tougher climate change. And I think this is that there's a larger underlying insight about that, which is kind of looping back to Ragi's concern about that overlap between state and business responsibility, right? Because it's not in those political and collaborative solutions in which corporations can also play leading roles. It is really not about, at least in my view, it's not about replacing state responsibility. It's not about, corporations, taking over from the state, but it's really about leveraging state responsibility and pushing the state to actually, take on their responsibility. I think that is well understood, that the well understood political role of corporations. It's not to kind of take over, because I think that would or can be indeed, and I think Ragi is right there, it can be indeed dangerous. But it's about seeing themselves just as we, see it as citizens of the political community, that we push our government to adopt certain policies and regulations. That the same applies to business in that sense. And as I said before, always assuming, and that's of course that conceptual assumption, that we want them to do so if they, under the assumption that they do so in a genuine, authentic, and public-spirited way. But if they do so, then I think that is the right kind of direction of that advocacy claim. I'm not sure if that really addresses the question. Okay.
Please, Gustavo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria, and I thank all the research group for the organization and for the invitation. But I would like especially to thank Professor Wettstein for the presentation. It was really clarifying and provocative. I had the opportunity to read some of your work as our colleague Natalia, and if you allow, I would like to seize the opportunity to learn a little more now in person. I made 3 questions here. Would you prefer me to pose to present one by one, or the 3 of them, and then you make a joint answer, Professor?
You can as it is better for you, you can ask them all 3, and then I can address them later. Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
I'll try to make it the more systematic I can. The first question, and I would put some emphasis on the last part of the presentation regarding the political advocacy by corporations. And regarding this, the first question would be about a subject you addressed in one of your papers that would concern some material limitations on the values that are supported by corporations in this advocacy. I mean, it's appropriate. It's easier to understand and to support the advocacy when the corporations are supporting more clearly democratic positions and the protection of human rights. And values seem to be a fundamental component of the idea of advocacy that makes it different from other sorts of political participation from companies, if I understood correctly. My question would give a step back maybe and ask about a possible normative theory to determine the content of these values defended in advocacy. I mean, would there be any material limitations to corporate political advocacy? And I mean, Professor, this is especially sensitive for us in Brazil because we have a history of complicity by companies with authoritarian tendencies, including through manifestations. If you allow me, I separated an excerpt from an editorial by a major Brazilian communication company, Globo, in which this major communication company supported the military coup that established the dictatorship here between 64 and 85. It says, this is the company. We participated in the 1964 revolution, they call it revolution, not a coup, identified with the national desire to preserve democratic institutions threatened by ideological radicalization, strikes, social disorder, and widespread corruption, end of quote. And it's interesting for me that this, I don't know if you consider this as a political advocacy, but it utilizes the grammar of democracy and protection of institutions, something that could be used by the other side to support a very different position. And I would utilize also these concepts as basic grounds to determine these material limitations, but I'm also concerned that they might be manipulated by corporations themselves nowadays to determine the sense, the directions of their advocacy. That would be the first question, Professor. The second one would be about how could we develop accountability tools for this advocacy. I mean, I think I can divide it into two. The first concern is about the possibility of corporations utilize advocacy as a strategy to dominate certain markets. I mean, I imagine a hypothesis in which a multinational company raises its voice to manifest itself against a certain environmental public policy in a certain country. But this very same company is lenient in relation to regulatory rollbacks in another country, also regarding environmental law, for example. Perhaps this country in which the company is lenient, a developing country in which it tries to gain more space within the market. The question here is how to develop accountability mechanisms for companies that operate in different locations. But in some countries adopting, for example, environmental friendly positions, while in others it supports measures such as the disinstitutionalization of these protection mechanisms. Are there accountability mechanisms? And if so, how would they be? And to end, Professor, I'm sorry if I am taking too long, Professor and my colleagues. As I said, I am also an enthusiast of the idea of companies assuming their responsibilities and engaging actively in advocacy. But my question is, in spite of this expectation of ours, what if they don't? What if they don't? What could be done in order to stimulate such attitude that we expect? Let me give some context from the Brazilian perspective, if I might. In Brazil, since the beginning of the pandemic, the current administration of the federal government has encouraged the use by the population of medicines, drugs that are not effective against COVID-19. Just an example, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. At the same time, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies that manufacture this drug only manifested itself in April 2021, this current year, more than a year since the beginning of the pandemic, stating that its medicine, its drug, chloroquine, is not effective against COVID-19. But in the previous year, just silence while the government defended the use as a medical solution, so people would not be so worried about the virus. That is one of the conclusions of the recent parliamentary investigation that occurred here in our country. So, I mean, based on this, right, in this example, just as an example, really, what if the expectation of ours of this active engagement is constantly frustrated, so that corporations don't speak out against violations of the values they claim to profess? What if instead they show complicity behaviors, as you showed in your presentation, or even further, if they show moral neutrality in relation to abuse in society, in societies where they operate? By that, I assume, and based on your paper, I found it very interesting that you acknowledge the limitation of compliance as a means to reach this stimulation, let's call it that, because compliance is more about it might get other results, but maybe not this effective reorientation of corporate behavior in the sense that you defended so well here. So this would be the third question. What if they don't? It might we might consider that the customers, like the consumers, has some role to play, but I'm also a little concerned that we might put so much weight on the shoulders of individuals as if they could be responsible for more systemic problems. So these are the thoughts I would like to raise based on your brilliant presentation papers, and I'm really waiting to learn more from you, Professor. Sorry for taking too long, but the subject and the presentation was very interesting. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. Those are excellent questions. They really cut, you know, to the very core of the also dilemmas that I've been, you know, thinking about and grappling with in terms of coming up, you know, with this account also of corporate advocacy, because you do kind of point to the perhaps also inherent, I wouldn't call it contradictions, but the inherent conflicts that you have to address if you in a sense call for corporations engaging in those roles, right? Because there of course there is it is in a gray zone, and there is a lot of ambiguity of when is it okay and when it is not okay for corporations to engage in those activities. And I'll start with the first question you briefly asked about the kind of foundation on which this is based, right? The paper that really addresses the corporate political advocacy that I've written, that one is perhaps slightly different than the kind of human rights advocacy that I've also written about in other contexts, because it's in a sense much broader, right? It's if you address human rights advocacy in the context of silent complicity, that context is fairly narrow, and you really talk about you know, egregious human rights violations. So there, I think that the foundation is really kind of a human rights based approach to corporate political activity, right? So that the very process of engaging in advocacy needs to correspond to human rights, and the result that comes from it needs to promote human rights as well. So then it's attached to really kind of the foundation of human rights. But the political advocacy piece is not necessarily, so it could be, I think it could be put on that foundation too, but it's not done so explicitly. I think the foundation there is more kind of maybe a more general rationalist perspective on corporate advocacy, in the sense that a corporation cannot consistently, and that's why rationalists cannot consistently advocate for causes that would ultimately undermine the foundation of society that makes this kind of engagement possible in the first place, right? And we've seen those rationalist accounts in many different areas as well. Even I mean, there's even rationalists, of course, foundations of human rights as such, right? So that you cannot deny someone else's human rights and at the same time claim the same rights for you, because denying kind of the subjectivity of the person in front of you also means that you deny your own right or your own kind of own status as a rational subject in that sense. And I think that is probably the foundation of the account of political advocacy that in that paper, right? But of course, and if you read the paper, I think it's much more about, we've addressed it to some degree in there. I think because we were forced to do so by the reviewers, but it was much more, of course, meant to be also a very practical account of making sense of what we have seen emerge as a corporate practice during that time, and really trying to capture it from a conceptual point of view and say, hey, look, there is a corporate practice emerging that nobody has really written and talked about, and it seems interesting and also relevant enough that we should address it, without perhaps yet really putting it on a very solid ground in terms of the foundation. But I would say that you know, the kind of it is kind of a rationalist foundation that is underlying the claim, and of course, and you alluded to that too, and of course, I think exactly practically, especially if you look at practice, I think that potential to manipulation and abuse of this practice is almost inherent to the concept, and this is what makes it, in a sense, dangerous and also unpredictable and difficult to also really see behind the true reasons and rationales for why corporations engage in those activities, right? But that is exactly the reason why in later texts, perhaps, I've put much more emphasis on human rights as a foundation, and also especially that claim that the severity of the human rights violation that it is at stake provides, in a sense, the legitimacy of corporations to speak out. That's in some sense exactly the reason why that unease with corporations speaking up for anything and everything under the sun without actually having, you know, a true, thorough, and urgent legitimation for doing so. I think that was exactly the reason, and that's also why, for example, as a safeguard, I would always claim that corporations should act in collaboration, for example, with human rights institutions, which have a public legitimacy to some extent, to speak for human rights issue and to speak on behalf also of groups that are disadvantaged and marginalized and violated in their rights, which a corporation does not, because corporations are much more often on the side of the perpetrators than on the side of the protectors of human rights. And because it adds also a layer of accountability, right? So that, I mean, I share your concern, absolutely, and it's one that I've always been grappling with, and not perhaps not even be 100% sure myself, you know, on which side I am leaning. But I think that's exactly what makes it so interesting, also to see it in practice, happening in practice, and then think about, well, what are the conditions that we want to see in place for this to be seen as a legitimate practice of corporations that, you know, if you could say, that have earned the right to advocate for those issues. The second question is about accountability mechanisms for corporations kind of acting inconsistently across different jurisdictions, which is something that we see often, right? And we've seen it. You know, it's a very current example. We've had the corporate responsibility, the business responsibility initiative in Switzerland, which was an initiative for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, and similar initiatives are, you know, in other countries and on the European plane. And Nestle, for example, is a company that took a position against the initiative and against such legislation in Switzerland, but is now embracing the same kind of legislation for the European context. Right? Same company, two completely different positions in different jurisdictions, and of course that raises the question first, you know, why are they opposing this in Switzerland but not elsewhere? And of course, I think there you see that there's of course a certain opportunity opportunism attached to this. And then that's your question: what should we do about it? Or what can we do about this incoherence in company positions and this hypocrisy in a sense, right? And I'm not quite sure what can be done about it. I mean, in our context, I mean, Nestle was called out immediately, of course, by the NGO community in Switzerland for the hypocrisy of kind of fighting the law in Switzerland and then kind of putting their weight behind it in Europe, because they probably saw, well, you know, there's no way around it. One reason could also be that they see that if they embrace the European call for such legislation, that might actually open the door for them to have a larger influence on what that law ultimately is going to look like. So completely, not only opportunistic, but in a sense, a rationale that goes completely against this idea of advocacy for human rights, right? So they, under the pretext of advocating for such a law, they're trying to actually undermine and water it down ultimately, right? And I think the only accountability mechanism that we have for this kind of behavior right now is really a critical public and a critical civil society sector. But we also know that the limits of what the civil society sector can do is you know, that is fairly narrow. I mean, they can, of course, call out companies like Nestle, which are highly exposed and visible. But there are thousands of other companies that operate according to the same principles that will fly under the radar and will be flying under the radar for you know, times to come. And I think that relates ultimately also to the last question that you asked, you know, what if they don't? And you know, who also can hold them accountable, and who can make sure that they take on the responsibility if they don't want to. But I think, and you mentioned it yourself, I mean, of course we can put some responsibility on the shoulders of consumers and some responsibility on the shoulders of investors, and I think investors particularly have quite some leverage in this regard. But also there, of course, that's kind of it's instrumental business case that I've criticized before to some degree, also because there's clear limits to what we can achieve there. And I think that question really raises the larger underlying issue about the corporate form in and of itself. You know, that if we have created an institution that almost by nature cannot be kind of contained in a sense that, you know, made responsible inherently and in a genuine sense, and that we're just trying to, you know, put band-aids on where it's most urgent. But I think that the fundamental issue, I think, has really to do with the very idea of the corporation, about it, you know, as in a sense a profit maximizing institution, and the context which will always be there that make it more beneficial for that kind of institution to violate human rights rather than promote it, right? And we can try to find, and that's what the UNGPs, for example, do, we can try to find, you know, a smart mix of different accountability mechanisms, state-based, non-state-based, different stakeholders can play different roles in holding corporations accountable. But the very fact that we have to look for those kind of mechanisms and have to look for them so hard, and we still can't figure out how to hold them accountable, I think does put the question in the room of, you know, maybe we are dealing with a much more fundamental problem that we actually want to admit, and which is really the institution of the corporation that is currently destroying the world, and we can't really stop it, right? We haven't really found the way to stop, and I think that would kind of play the ball back to the philosophers in a sense of trying to come up with alternative visions of what a truly sustainable economy could look like. right? But there, I also don't have the answer. I'm still also part of the crowd that tries to find accountability mechanisms to at least contain the damage that we're causing right now.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the clarifications. Thanks for that.
Professor, we probably have like 3 or 4 questions. Do you prefer that we make like a panel between we Daniela, João, and I think?
To answer all the questions and then I answer it, you mean?
Yes, concerning the time that you've mentioned, I think that we almost passed the extra an hour.
Yeah, I was talking too much. I apologize. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, that we collect the question and I try to kind of address them.
No, sorry, Professor, it was brilliant. Thank you so much. So please, Daniela would like to go first.
Okay, so I'll try to make it as briefly as possible. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. But well, my question relates a lot about the relationship between CSR and ESG and how you see it. I mean, at least both, for instance, ESG and CSR have been portrayed already as cousins of B&HR, B&HR and ESG as cousins of CSR. They have some relations, but they have different regions, like CSR is from managerial studies, business scholarship, ESG is way more related to financial markets. I see them both as concerned with way more about reporting and performance and appearance rather than actual behavior, which would be, for instance, a concern of B&HR. But my question is, I've been having this feeling that the main way corporations and even scholarship discuss CSR issues today is through the ESG frame, as if ESG is the new topic of discussion, and also almost like in place of CSR, even setting it aside a bit. So I'd like to know if you also share this. What do you think about this new trend of CSR and ESG being in front of CSR and the relationship between that and B&HR? And if your critics to CSR in the sense as being limited could also be applied to the critics of CSG, also considering ESG is more related to financial markets and an idea of shareholder value usually. So it's about that. Thank you.
So João would like to go first, or may I?
Yes, my question is very related, in fact, to Daniela's. So I think because of the time, please, Victoria, I think you could ask your question for you to have more time, and Professor Florian can answer all of them.
So, Professor, you mentioned that as an implication for CSR, for the supply chain disruptions, and we had, at the same year, we had 2 major proposals in Germany and the European Union concerning more solid obligations towards business concerning the due diligence standards. So you mentioned the idea of the CSR as a private responsibility, like an incomplete and missed part of the problem. So it's intuitive to understand from this perspective that the state has still a very important role. But in the last decades, it seems that it has been a movement of distancing between corporations and the state, to the point that this privatization, some say that corporations should solve much of the problems that the state just can handle. So my first question related to these legal initiatives is if should not be implemented a particular balance between ex ante and ex post legislative approaches concerning due diligence obligations, because I imagine it will show variation across jurisdictions, and it would be easily to identify, for instance, that despite we are dealing most of the time with major big corporations, there is still actually no one-size-fits-all solution. And my second question is related to our experience with the pandemic here in Brazil. One thing that was made clear with COVID in our country is the key importance and necessity of active cooperation between government and regulatory authorities and business representatives in order to achieve the goals of CSR. I mean, we had examples of bad, but also good practice during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this shouldn't encourage governments to make the necessary decisions regarding the development of CSR and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, in this context, how can we think about this reapproachment between corporations and the state as a regulator? So I would very much like to hear your comments on these two reflections. Thank you. And if we don't have any other questions, so I think this is the last one.
All right, perfect. So I'm gonna address Daniela's question first about that. It's actually an interesting question about the intersection between CSR, or the shift also between CSR and ESG. And one question that you ask is whether the same criticism that applies to CSR also applies to ESG. I'm not quite sure, because I think ESG, because it also kind of addresses financial markets first and foremost, actually it's perhaps a very intent of ESG to remedy at least some of the CSR problems, although not necessarily ones that I address from a more responsibility perspective, more the ones that, for example, investors would see with CSR, which is that CSR is often seen as a very fluffy concept, right? Which is it's not measurable. That you can't really tell what the impact of that concept is. It's difficult to measure social performance, and many have tried to do so of businesses. And I think ESG is an attempt also to make social, environmental, and governance efforts of businesses measurable and attach it to certain metrics that investors then can use. But so in that sense, it does remedy, I think, that fluffiness in a sense of CSR, but it also creates, of course, new problems. For example, especially if you attach it, for example, to human rights, because whenever you make things measurable that in some sense are not measurable to begin with, then you have mere approximations, and by attaching then investment criteria to that, the approximations turn into the actual goal that businesses try to achieve. I mean, we have the same issue with, it has been mentioned before, with certain compliance issues, right? Where it's not the underlying subset that you only do what's measurable, right? And as such, then the race that is in terms of that is going on in terms of making human rights measurable is really, make them measurable to the largest degree, because that will ensure that corporations ultimately address them, because they will see that investors are actually putting an eye on this. But ultimately, also here, I think it's only probably the second best approach. Of course, preferable would be if corporations address human rights from a genuine point of view, not because it pays, not because they have to, because investors force them, but because they feel like this is a necessary part of doing business, that we don't violate human rights and do business in a way that kind of fosters human rights in that sense. Yeah, I think that's the quick answer that I can give to this one. And then the second the second question, I wasn't quite sure whether I captured it correctly. That the first one about different national regimes of human rights due diligence, and the fact that there is no one size fits all approach. So absolutely, I think that's, but I'm not sure whether I'm going in the right direction here. I think that's one of the main issues that we face in terms of human rights due diligence legislation currently, is that the most promising avenue that we have to put regulation in place is our domestic legislations, and by definition, I think they do have to take the national specificities of the domestic realm that they try to regulate into account, and as such, they differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, which again cannot fully solve the problem of the governance gaps that led to the business and human rights problem in the very beginning, right? On the other hand, I think the solution that could address this problem is really not only a regional but a global approach. But I mean, we currently see what the problem is with putting such an instrument in place, and actually finding a consensus about such an instrument. I think that's years out, and if we get to the point where we have a global treaty on business and human rights, I think the best probably that such a treaty can do is again encourage or mandate states to put domestic regulation in place. And so it's kind of a, the snake bites in its own tail there. But I think that's just the way we have at least to currently deal with those issues. I think the most promising that we see currently in terms of in the regulatory realm emerges is probably the European legislation. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, and I'm sure it's going to be watered down quite a bit still. But in terms of effectiveness, I think a regional approach such as the European Union is trying to put in place, that could really turn into a major game changer, I think, in this discussion, much more, I think, the global treaty. And then the second question you had, I can't read my notes anymore. Can you ask a second question again?
Sure, Professor. My second question was related to our experience here in Brazil. I think that we've learned with this COVID experience that there's a key importance of this active cooperation between government and the regulatory authorities and business representatives. And we had several bad examples, but also good practice during the COVID-19 pandemic. And despite this movement of distancing between corporations and the state, how could we think more about this reapproachment between corporations and the state as a regulator?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, yeah, exactly. I mean, it kind of cuts back a little bit to what I addressed before, right? That my take is that it's always important that that it's about leveraging state responsibility also, and also, in some sense, also holding the state accountable for those public issues, but corporations can play a role in this. And I think what is important there as well, and that's also a new discussion that is kind of coming up and playing also in the business and human rights realm, is the one about, well, what should the overarching framework be of such collaborations between states and corporations? And here, of course, we have the SDGs, right, which have really kind of become the major reference point for collaborations, multi-sector collaborations, to address those fundamental problems. And there's, as with all those frameworks and instruments, there's pros and cons to it, right? I think it can be a powerful frame for really leveraging also corporate capabilities to put them to good use to address some of the fundamental problems that we have. On the other hand, the SDG framework in and of itself is just fundamentally incomplete, especially in terms of, for example, human rights, accountability, and so on. And so pairing the SDGs with the UNGPs, for example, I think that could be a promising way to frame and to build a foundation for such collaborations, because then we do have the negative do no harm side, the holding corporations accountable for not violating human rights, and on top of that, we have a powerful reference point for what such effective collaborations could be to address the crisis that we face as a society. But there's much more to say about this, of course, but unfortunately we lack the time to do so.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. I really share your perspective. And if we don't have any other comment or reflection, in the name of the Business and Human Rights Working Group, I would like to thank you so much, Professor Florian, our debaters, Natalia and Gustavo, Professor Eduardo, my colleagues, Daniela and João, our audience. We had here today a very special panel with rich discussion concerning the COVID-19 approach and the consequences towards CSR. So thank you so much for the very interesting presentation and for your time. I just want to mention that all of our webinars are available on our channel on YouTube, and we look forward to count on you in our last event in December. So thank you so much all.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being with you today. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Professor. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.